My mom had me when she was 19, and my dad left before I was even born. According to her, they'd been dating for only a couple of months when she got pregnant, and when she told him, he didn't hesitate to walk away. She let him go without a fight. No child support, no drama. She always said she didn't want to trap him in something he didn't want, but even as a kid, I couldn't help but wonder if she regretted that decision. I think a part of her resented me for it, though she never said it outright. Growing up, it was just the two of us. My grandparents helped a lot, financially and emotionally, but my mom was always trying to prove she could handle it on her own. She worked 2 jobs while finishing school, and I admired her for that. I remember thinking how strong she was, how much she must have loved me to work so hard to give me a decent life. But there were cracks in that image even back then. She wasn't the warm, supportive type of mom. She loved me, sure, but it was conditional. I learned early on that her approval depended on how much I could stay out of the way. When I was 8, she met Eric, a guy she worked with. He was nice enough, the kind of man who always had a joke ready but didn't talk much otherwise. He moved in with us after about a year, and they got married when I was 11. Eric wasn't bad, but he wasn't exactly interested in being a father figure either. He'd take me to baseball games sometimes, or help me with homework, but it always felt like he was checking a box more than actually wanting to connect. I didn't mind. I was used to keeping to myself, and by then, I'd figured out how to keep the peace. Things shifted when my mom got pregnant again. I was 12 when they told me, and I still remember how excited she looked when she broke the news. It was like a light had been switched on inside her. She glowed in a way I'd never seen before, and for a second, I let myself hope that maybe this would bring us closer. Maybe she'd finally let me in. But it wasn't like that. The closer she got to her due date, the more distant she became. It was subtle at first. She'd forget to ask about my day, or tell me to keep my voice down because I was stressing her out. But over time, it got worse. She'd snap at me for little things, like leaving my shoes by the door or taking too long in the shower. Eric started picking up on it too. He wasn't mean about it, but he'd make comments like, "Maybe give your mom some space, kid. She's got a lot on her plate." I thought it was just hormones, that things would go back to normal once the baby came. The twins were born a few months later, and everything changed. My mom was completely wrapped up in them, and I started to feel like a guest in my own home. I tried to help out, feeding them, changing diapers, whatever she needed, but it didn't seem to make a difference. If anything, she got more frustrated with me. She'd tell me I wasn't doing things right or that I was hovering too much. Eric backed her up, saying I needed to focus on school and let them handle the parenting. By the time the twins were 6 months old, the distance between us was impossible to ignore. One night, my mom and Eric sat me down at the kitchen table. I could tell by the way they were avoiding eye contact that it wasn't going to be a normal conversation. My mom started by saying how proud she was of me for being so independent, for helping out as much as I had. She said I was growing up fast, and she knew I'd be ready to take on more responsibility soon. Then she dropped the bomb. They had decided it was time for me to spread my wings, as she put it. With the twins, things were tight financially, and they needed to focus on giving them the best start in life. She didn't say it outright, but the message was clear. I wasn't a priority anymore. Eric chimed in, saying they weren't kicking me out, not technically, but they thought it would be best if I moved in with my grandparents for now. I sat there, stunned, as they laid out their plan like it was no big deal. I offered to get a part-time job to help with expenses, but my mom shut that down immediately. She said she didn't want me to burden myself at such a young age, and that this was for the best. Her words were soft, almost rehearsed, but her eyes told a different story. She wanted me gone. I packed my things that night. My grandparents welcomed me with open arms, but I could see the hurt in their eyes when I told them what had happened. They tried to convince me that my mom was just overwhelmed, that she didn't mean to push me away, but I wasn't so sure. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been replaced, that I was just an inconvenience she was finally rid of. At 16, I started working part-time to help out around the house. My grandparents were supportive, but they were getting older, and I didn't want to be a burden. I focused on school and kept my head down, only seeing my mom and Eric occasionally when they visited for holidays. Even then, it was awkward. She barely looked at me, and when she did, it was like she didn't recognize me anymore. I stopped hoping things would go back to the way they were. It was easier that way. Life with my grandparents was quieter, more stable. They didn't have much, but they always made me feel welcome. My grandmother, in particular, went out of her way to make sure I felt like I belonged. She'd bake my favorite cookies when she knew I was having a rough day, or she'd sit with me at the kitchen table and ask about school like it was the most important thing in the world. I didn't realize how much I'd missed that kind of attention until I had it again. But even with their support, I couldn't shake the weight of everything that had happened. My mom's absence felt like a hole in my chest, and as much as I told myself I didn't care, I did. I spent a lot of nights staring at my ceiling, wondering what I'd done wrong. Why wasn't I enough? What did the twins have that I didn't? Those thoughts haunted me, but I didn't let them show. I threw myself into school and my part-time job, telling myself that if I worked hard enough, I could make something of myself and leave all this behind. The first few months, I barely heard from my mom. She'd call my grandparents occasionally to check on me, but she never asked to talk to me directly. When she did visit, she'd bring the twins, and all her attention would be on them. She'd show off how much they'd grown, how they were already starting to talk or walk, like she was expecting praise. I played along, keeping the peace for my grandparents' sake, but every visit chipped away at me. It was like I'd been downgraded to some distant relative, someone who didn't matter anymore. When it came time to start thinking about college, I knew I couldn't count on her for help. I didn't even bother asking. Instead, I turned to my uncle, my mom's younger brother. He wasn't rich, but he had a good job and a kind heart. I asked him if he'd be willing to co-sign a student loan for me, and to my surprise, he said yes without hesitation. He told me he was proud of me for pushing through everything and that he believed in me. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that until he said it. With his help, I managed to secure the loan and got into a state university. Moving into the dorms was a chaotic, lonely experience. My grandparents were too old to help me move, and my mom didn't even offer. I relied on a couple of friends and did the rest myself, hauling boxes up 3 flights of stairs and setting up my tiny dorm room alone. I remember sitting on the bed that first night, staring at the empty walls, and feeling a strange mix of pride and sadness. I had made it here on my own, but I couldn't help wishing someone else had been there to see it. College was tough at first. Between classes, part-time work, and keeping up with my loan payments, I barely had time to think. But in a way, that was a blessing. Staying busy kept me from dwelling on the past, and slowly, I started to find my footing. I made friends, joined a few clubs, and even started to enjoy myself. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building a life that was mine. My mom called me exactly once during my 4 years at college. It was my second year, and the call came out of the blue. She didn't ask how I was doing or if I needed anything. Instead, she launched into a long story about how the twins were thriving in school and how Eric had just gotten a promotion at work. It felt like she was trying to prove something, though I couldn't figure out what. I listened politely, throwing in the occasional, "That's great," or "Wow," but I kept waiting for her to ask about me. She never did. The call ended with her saying, "Well, take care of yourself," like she was talking to a neighbor instead of her son. That call was the nail in the coffin for me. I stopped hoping she'd come around, stopped waiting for her to care. I focused on myself, my future, and the people who had actually been there for me. When I graduated, my grandparents and uncle were the only ones who showed up. My mom didn't even send a text. It stung, but by then, I was used to it. After college, I landed a job in a small marketing firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me room to grow. I moved into a tiny apartment, budgeted carefully, and chipped away at my student loans. It wasn't easy, but I took pride in the fact that I was doing it all on my own. Every promotion, every small success felt like a victory, proof that I didn't need my mom's support to make it. Over the years, I worked my way up the ladder. By the time I hit my late 20s, I was in a senior management position at a larger company, making more money than I ever thought possible. I bought my first car, started saving for a house, and even treated myself to a few vacations. Life was good, better than I'd ever imagined. Then, out of nowhere, my mom reached out again. It had been almost a decade since that last call in college, and I hadn't heard a word from her since. She showed up at my door one evening, unannounced, with Eric by her side. The sight of them standing there, older but still familiar, sent a wave of mixed emotions through me. I hadn't seen them in years, and yet it felt like no time had passed. They asked if they could come in, and against my better judgment, I let them. I had no idea what they wanted, but something in my gut told me this wasn't just a casual visit. They didn't waste any time getting to the point. After a few awkward pleasantries, my mom started talking about how she'd heard through family, likely my uncle, that I was doing well for myself. She congratulated me on my success, but it felt hollow, like she was reading from a script. Eric chimed in, nodding along, throwing in the occasional, "You've really come far," or "We're proud of you." The whole thing felt rehearsed, like they'd practiced how to butter me up before dropping whatever bombshell they had planned. I sat there, arms crossed, waiting for the real reason they'd come. Then it hit. My mom cleared her throat, shifted in her seat, and said, "Well, there's actually something we wanted to talk to you about." She glanced at Eric, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. That's when she laid it out. They were struggling financially. The business they tried to start had failed years ago. Eric had lost his job, and they were drowning in debt. To make matters worse, the twins were about to graduate high school and were applying to colleges they couldn't afford. She looked at me with this expression that was almost pleading and said, "We need your help. We know you've worked hard to get where you are, and we wouldn't ask if it weren't serious, but we're hoping you could contribute toward their tuition. Just enough to get them started." I stared at her, stunned. I'd expected something selfish, maybe a loan for their bills or help covering their mortgage. But this? Asking me to pay for the college education of two kids I barely knew? That was a new level of audacity. I took a deep breath and said, as calmly as I could, "You're asking me to pay for the twins to go to college? Why? Why would you think that's my responsibility?" My mom sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable. "They're your siblings. Family helps family, and you're in a position to help. You know we've had a hard time these last few years. We wouldn't ask if we didn't need it." Eric jumped in then, his tone softer, trying to play peacemaker. "We're not asking you to cover everything, just to help out a little. You're doing well. We've heard about your job, and the twins deserve a good start, just like you had." That was it. That last line pushed me over the edge. I could feel the anger rising in my chest, and before I could stop myself, I snapped, "A good start? Are you kidding me? I didn't have a good start. I was kicked out of the house when I was 16 because you two decided I didn't fit into your perfect little family anymore. I worked my ass off to get here, with no help from either of you. And now you think I should just hand over money for your kids because they deserve it?" My mom looked taken aback, like she hadn't expected me to call her out so directly. She opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't done. I had to take out loans, work part-time jobs, and rely on Uncle Steve just to make it through college. Do you remember how many times I called you, asking for help, and you ignored me? Or how you didn't even bother showing up to my graduation? You made it clear a long time ago that I wasn't part of your family. So don't stand here now and act like we're some big happy unit just because it's convenient for you." Eric shifted uncomfortably, but my mom didn't back down. Instead, she said, "I know we made mistakes, but we did the best we could at the time. You have to understand, we were under so much pressure back then. The twins needed us, and you were old enough to take care of yourself." "That's not an excuse," I shot back. "I was a kid, and you chose to prioritize them over me. Fine, that was your decision. But don't come crawling back now, expecting me to fix your problems." The room went quiet for a moment, the tension so thick it was hard to breathe. My mom's face hardened, and I could tell she was about to switch tactics. Sure enough, her tone shifted from defensive to accusatory. "You're being selfish. After everything I've done for you, you can't even help your own family? I raised you on my own for years. Do you know how hard that was for me? The sacrifices I made?" I laughed bitterly. "You mean the sacrifices you threw in my face every chance you got? I didn't ask to be born, and raising me wasn't some favor you did for me. It was your responsibility as a parent. Don't try to guilt me into thinking I owe you something for doing the bare minimum." Eric put a hand on her arm, trying to calm her down, but she yanked it away and stood up. "I can't believe this. You've turned into such a cold, ungrateful person." I thought I raised you better than this. I stood up too, my patience completely gone. You didn't raise me. You abandoned me. So don't stand here and pretend like you're some martyr. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. I don't owe you anything. She glared at me, her face red with anger, but she didn't say anything else. Eric muttered something under his breath about how they should go, and after a tense moment, they finally left. As the door closed behind them, I felt a mix of emotions, anger, relief, and a deep sadness I couldn't quite shake. I knew I'd done the right thing by standing my ground, but it didn't make it any easier. No matter how much I tried to tell myself I didn't care, a part of me still wished things had been different. I wanted a mom who cared, a family that supported each other. But that wasn't my reality, and it never would be. For the rest of the night, I tried to distract myself, but their visit lingered in my mind. I wondered if that was the last time I'd ever see them, and if it was, whether I'd be okay with that. Part of me already knew the answer. The days after their visit were quiet, but the weight of everything they'd said stayed with me. I replayed the conversation in my head, wondering if I'd been too harsh, too unforgiving. But every time I started to second-guess myself, I remembered the years of silence, the rejection, and how hard I'd fought to get where I was without their help. They had made their choices, and now they wanted me to clean up their mess. I couldn't let myself feel guilty for standing my ground. Then, out of nowhere, my mom started emailing me. The first message came late one evening, short and polite, almost too polite. She wrote that she'd been thinking about our conversation and wanted to clear the air. She claimed she didn't mean to upset me, that she just wanted to find a way for us to move forward as a family. But even in her carefully worded sentences, I could feel the familiar tug of guilt. She didn't apologize for anything, didn't acknowledge the things I'd said or the hurt she'd caused. Instead, she kept circling back to how hard things were for her and Eric, how much the twins needed help. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said. But a few days later, she sent another email. This one was longer, more emotional. She talked about how much she struggled raising me on her own, how she worked so hard to give me a good life, and how hurt she was that I refused to see things from her perspective. She didn't outright say I owed her, but it was heavily implied. She ended the message with a plea, "Please, don't let pride keep us from being a family again." I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of anger and frustration. She still didn't get it. She didn't understand that it wasn't pride keeping us apart. It was the years of neglect, the way she'd thrown me aside when it was convenient for her. I ignored the email, thinking that maybe she'd give up if I didn't engage. But she didn't. The emails kept coming, each one more desperate than the last. She started bringing up memories from my childhood, little anecdotes about times when we were happy, trying to remind me of the bond we used to have. It was manipulative, and I knew it, but it still stung. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I finally broke. I opened her latest email and typed out a response. I didn't hold back. I told her exactly how I felt, how much she had hurt me, and how I'd spent years trying to move on from the damage she'd done. I reminded her that she had made her choices, choosing Eric, choosing the twins, choosing to let me go, and that she couldn't rewrite history just because it suited her now. I told her I wasn't interested in rebuilding a relationship with someone who couldn't even admit they'd done anything wrong. Then I hit send and blocked her email. It felt good to finally say everything I'd been holding in for years, but the relief didn't last long. The very next day, I got a call from my grandparents. My grandmother sounded upset as she told me my mom had shown up at their house again, crying and begging them to talk to me. She had spun the story to make herself the victim, claiming I was being unfair and refusing to give her a chance to make things right. My grandmother didn't believe her, of course, but she was worried. She said my mom looked unwell, that she seemed desperate in a way they hadn't seen before. I told her I wasn't changing my mind. I loved my grandparents, but I wasn't going to let them guilt me into doing something I knew wasn't right for me. They understood, but I could tell it pained them to be caught in the middle. I hated that my mom was dragging them into this, but there wasn't much I could do about it. The next escalation came a week later. I was at work when my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, but the number called again and again. By the third call, I picked up, already irritated. It was her. "Why are you ignoring me?" she said, her voice sharp and angry. "I'm your mother, for God's sake. You can't just cut me out of your life like this." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "You're violating the restraining order by calling me. Do you want to get yourself in more trouble?" "Restraining order," she scoffed. "Is that really necessary? I'm trying to fix things, and you're treating me like a criminal. You showed up at my house, you've been harassing me with emails, and now you're calling me from random numbers. What do you expect me to do? Pretend everything's fine?" I was trying to stay calm, but my voice was rising with every word. "I just want to talk," she said, her tone softening. "I miss you. I miss us." "There is no us," I snapped. "Not anymore. You made that decision years ago when you pushed me out of your life. I've moved on, and I suggest you do the same." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, I thought she'd hung up. But then she spoke, her voice trembling. "I just want my family back." I didn't have the energy to argue anymore. "It's too late for that," I said and hung up. That night, I couldn't sleep. As much as I wanted to believe I was doing the right thing, the conversation replayed in my mind. Her words, her tone, the cracks in her voice, it all lingered like a bad dream. But no matter how much I thought about it, the conclusion was always the same. I couldn't go back. Not after everything. In the days that followed, I focused on myself. I put my energy into work, into planning for the future, into the life I was building. I knew my mom wasn't done trying, but for now, I was determined to keep moving forward. She had taken enough of my life already. I wasn't going to let her take any more. For a little while, things went quiet. My mom stopped trying to contact me directly, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd finally gotten the message. I wasn't naive enough to think it was over completely, but the silence was a relief. I poured myself into my work, into settling into my new home, and into just enjoying the sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. It was strange how peaceful life felt without her shadow looming over everything. But deep down, I knew the calm wouldn't last. It was about 3 weeks later when she tried again, but this time, she didn't come for me directly. She went through my work. I was sitting at my desk when I got a call from reception, letting me know that a family member was downstairs asking to see me. My stomach sank the moment they said it, and I already knew who it was. I told them to let her know I wasn't available and that she needed to leave. But my mom, being my mom, refused. She insisted on waiting, saying it was urgent family business. I could feel the heat rising in my face as I asked reception to call security if she didn't leave in the next 5 minutes. Then I hung up and sat there, fuming. A part of me wanted to go down there, to face her, to tell her, again, to leave me alone. But I knew better. That's exactly what she wanted. A confrontation, a way to force me into interacting with her. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. A few minutes later, I got another call from reception letting me know security had escorted her out of the building. I thanked them and tried to focus on work, but my hands were shaking. It wasn't fear, it was anger. How dare she show up at my workplace? How far was she willing to go to drag me back into her mess? That evening, I called my lawyer to let them know what had happened. They reassured me that the restraining order was still valid and that I'd done the right thing by not engaging. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of it. My mom was desperate, and desperate people don't just stop because you tell them to. I was right. A few days later, I came home from work and found her waiting on my doorstep. She was sitting on the stairs, arms crossed, looking like she'd been there for hours. My heart sank at the sight of her, but I forced myself to stay calm. I set my bag down and stood a few feet away, keeping the door between us. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice steady but firm. She looked up at me, her eyes red and tired, and said, "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," I replied. "You're violating the restraining order again. If you don't leave, I'll have to call the police." Her expression darkened at that, and she stood up, taking a step toward me. "You would really do that? To your own mother?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I've warned you enough times. I'm done." That's when she lost it. Her voice rose, and she started yelling about how ungrateful I was, how she'd sacrificed so much for me, how I was selfish for refusing to help my family. She blamed me for everything that had gone wrong in her life, from her financial problems to her strained relationship with Eric. The longer she went on, the more unhinged she sounded. Neighbors started peeking out their windows, and I could feel their eyes on us. I told her to leave again, but instead, she took another step toward me and shoved me. It wasn't a hard shove, but it was enough to make me stumble back a little. That was the final straw. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911 right in front of her. She froze when she realized what I was doing, her face going pale. "You're really calling the police on me?" she hissed, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. "Yes," I said simply, holding the phone to my ear as I gave the operator my address. "You've given me no choice." When she saw that I wasn't bluffing, she tried to backtrack. Her tone softened, and she started pleading, saying she didn't mean to push me, that she just wanted to talk, that she was sorry. But it was too late. The police arrived a few minutes later, and by then, I was done arguing. I told them what had happened, and when one of my neighbors stepped forward to corroborate my story, they had no choice but to take her into custody. As they led her away, she turned to look at me one last time. Her eyes were full of anger, but there was something else there too. Maybe betrayal, maybe sadness. I didn't know and I didn't care. I stood there on the sidewalk, watching her go, and felt nothing but relief. That night, I sat on my couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything. A part of me wondered how things had gotten this bad, how my relationship with my mom had become so broken. But the truth was, it had been broken for years. I just spent most of my life pretending it wasn't. The next day, I called my lawyer again. They assured me that the incident only strengthened my case for the restraining order, and I decided to push for a more permanent solution. I couldn't keep living like this, waiting for her next move, wondering when she'd show up again. I needed to put an end to it, once and for all. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was taking control. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't how I wanted things to turn out, but it was necessary. I couldn't keep letting her disrupt my life. I deserved better. The restraining order was finalized within weeks, solid and airtight. My lawyer assured me that if my mom violated it again, the consequences would be severe. For the first time, I felt like there was real distance between us, a barrier she couldn't cross. I had taken every precaution to ensure she couldn't find her way back into my life. I updated my work, notified my neighbors, and even added extra security measures to my home. It felt like a clean slate, a chance to finally move forward without looking over my shoulder. But even with the legal protection, I couldn't fully shake the weight of what had happened. It wasn't just about the restraining order. It was about finally accepting that my mom wasn't going to change. There wouldn't be a moment of clarity where she'd realize the pain she caused. No heartfelt apology, no miraculous reunion. That chapter was over, and I had to let it go for good. I started throwing myself into building the life I'd always dreamed of. I took on new challenges at work, earned another promotion, and finally bought the house I'd been saving for. It was everything I could have hoped for, spacious, peaceful, and mine. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. No baggage, no interruptions, just me and the life I'd worked so hard to create. Then, a month after the restraining order was finalized, I got a call from Eric. I hadn't heard from him since he left my mom, and honestly, I didn't expect to ever hear from him again. I debated ignoring the call, but curiosity got the better of me. When I answered, his voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "I'm sorry to bother you," he started, "but I thought you should know what's going on." I stayed silent, waiting for him to explain. He took a deep breath and continued. "Your mom, she's not doing well. After everything that happened, she spiraled. She's been staying with some old friends, but they've had enough of her drama. I think she's out of options." There was a long pause, and I could hear the weight of his words in the silence. "I'm not asking you to do anything," he added quickly. "I just thought you should know. You deserve to know." I thanked him, but the call left me unsettled. It wasn't guilt. I knew I had made the right choices for myself, but there was something sobering about hearing how far she'd fallen. She'd alienated everyone, driven away the few people who still cared about her, and now she was alone. It wasn't my responsibility, but it still felt heavy. I didn't dwell on it long. Eric had made his choice to leave her behind, and I had made mine. It wasn't my job to save someone who had spent years tearing me down. If she ever decided to truly change, that would be her journey, not mine. I couldn't fix her, and I wasn't going to try. Weeks turned into months, and the silence stayed. My mom didn't try to contact me again, and Eric didn't call back with any updates. I settled into my new home, threw myself into my work, and started exploring the things I'd always wanted to do. I took a photography class, started traveling more, and even reconnected with some old friends I'd lost touch with over the years. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. One night, as I sat on the back porch of my new home, watching the sun set over the horizon, I realized just how far I'd come. Every choice I'd made, every painful moment, every step away from my mom's chaos, it had all led me here. I didn't need her approval or her love to be whole. I had built a life worth living, and for the first time, I felt free. That was the last time I thought about her in any serious way. Maybe one day I'll hear about her again. A fleeting mention at a family gathering or a message passed through someone else. But it won't change anything. She's a part of my story, but she's not my future. And that's okay.